Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. This is Dr. Daniel Kaplan, and my goal is to make sure that you have access to psychology in a reasonable way. And recently I was asked the question, what is anxiety and how does it differ from fear? So fear is your body's natural or physiological response to an actual threat. So if you were on the safari and you came across a lion, that would be fear, right? Because you would be concerned maybe the lion might attack you or there might be some threat to you. Whereas anxiety is a physiological response that's similar to fear, but it's due to usually a less overt threat. It's more of an inferred threat or an ambiguous threat. And that is pretty much how anxiety works, is that we perceive in our mind a threat, and that sets off a series of alarm bells. Now, in addition to that, in today's video, I'd also like to talk to you about generalized anxiety disorder and what that is and some of the understandings about how generalized anxiety disorder comes about. So here we go. Generalized anxiety disorder is actually one of the more common conditions that people come into therapy for. Many people describe generalized anxiety disorder as free-floating anxiety because there's no specific trigger, but the person reports constantly feeling apprehensive or nervous. And there are a whole host of features such as difficulty concentrating, muscle tension. People oftentimes have sleep problems. And what's important to understand about generalized anxiety disorder is it's a chronic condition. It's not a short-term condition. In order to be diagnosed with GAD, as it's referred to, you need to have these features for a minimum of 6 months. Now, generalized anxiety disorder is fairly common, as I said, in Western society. You will see that roughly 4% of the population will meet some of the criteria of GAD in a given year, and about 6% will meet the criteria across their lifetime. Usually it tends to emerge in childhood and adolescence. And what we tend to see is that about 1 out of 4 people with generalized anxiety disorder go into treatment because of its disruption on their functioning. I will also say that women tend to have a higher rate of diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder. It's about a 2-to-1 ratio, which is pretty significant. And there are a lot of explanations as to why women might have higher rates, and ethnic minorities have higher rates of generalized anxiety disorder. So let's start with perhaps one explanation. So the socio-cultural perspective suggests that there's something in our environment that's eliciting anxiety, right? And many people who are in a dangerous situation are keyed up. They tend to be more concerned. So if you're faced with real danger, it's possible to also generalize, hence the word generalized anxiety disorder, to other aspects of your life. And we do see research supporting this theory, such as, Hurricane Katrina and the Haiti earthquake and things like that. So from a socio-cultural point of view, one of the major explanations for generalized anxiety disorder is stress. And in general, women have more stress in society. There are more potential threats for victimization and so forth. So that anxiety might predispose women a little bit more. It also explains why many people from low-income communities also struggle with stress. So we see that poverty is a really impactful thing. So the communities tend to be run down a bit. There are higher crime rates, lower job options, greater health problems, all of these contributing to the stress. So lower income communities would be at higher risk. And ethnic minorities, as we mentioned earlier, they're also at higher risk because they tend to have higher rates of stressors due to racial profiling and many other environmental factors. So that's generalized anxiety disorder, the condition. We talked about the socio-cultural factors, but we should also talk about other models, other understandings. So the psychodynamic perspective is basically Freud and his followers, right? So Sigmund Freud believed that everything occurs from childhood, and ultimately all children experience anxiety, and there are different kinds of anxiety. There's realistic anxiety where there's a genuine threat or danger. But then there's neurotic anxiety and moral anxiety, which are more of the pathological features that could result in generalized anxiety disorder. So if a person is not allowed to express their base desires, which are more of the id impulses, they're more likely to acquire a neurotic anxiety. Now, the moral anxiety is a person is allowed to express their desires and impulses, but when they do, they're punished for it. So there's either fear that you're going to be punished for expressing your base desires, or you're ultimately blocked from expressing your base desires at all. And these are some of the anxieties that drive generalized anxiety disorder. Another window or another explanation from the psychodynamic perspective is the focus on the ego. And generally speaking, the ego is kind of the mediator of the mind, and it's responsible for coping with anxiety. And if the ego is underdeveloped, it is possible that you're going to be flooded with anxiety. So another suggestion is that a person's ego is underdeveloped, therefore they don't have the defenses against anxiety, and it floods them. So a third perspective on generalized anxiety disorder comes from the humanistic perspective. And Carl Rogers is probably the pioneer here we want to focus on. So anxiety comes from conditions of worth. And what Rogers suggests is that generally speaking, children learn from their parents certain messages, either that the parents love them regardless, or that the parents have certain standards that need to be met in order to receive the expression of love. If a person has a contingency on their parents' love, that's called conditions of worth. So the anxiety around what if I can't meet the high standards that either I set for myself or my parents set for me, that is going to create some anxiety in a person and is going to predispose a person to develop generalized anxiety disorder. From a cognitive point of view, there are different cognitive and cognitive behavioral mindsets. We're going to talk a little bit about Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck. But Albert Ellis is known for rational emotive behavioral therapy, and he suggested that there are some basic irrational assumptions. Now, Albert Ellis refers to these as irrational assumptions. Aaron Beck would refer to it as maladaptive thinking. But here are some kind of assumptions that a person might have adopted that could lead to generalized anxiety disorder. So one might think that they need to be loved or they need the approval of all the major people in their life in order to be satisfied. The problem with requiring love and approval from every significant person in your community is that not everyone is going to give you that. And if you feel that you need that, then when you don't get it, you start to worry, right? And that worry kind of adds up. Another uh, possible explanation is that people can awfulize or catastrophize, thinking that the worst is going to happen and it's guaranteed to happen to them. So, always waiting for the worst or always expecting the validation of your peers might create anxiety that people struggle with. So, that's Albert Ellis and his rational emotive behavioral therapy. But Aaron Beck was another cognitive theorist who basically suggested that we have these silent assumptions that imply danger. So a person might feel unsafe naturally until they're proven to be safe. Or, as I said, with catastrophizing, they might think that the mindset is always best to assume the worst so that you're not disappointed. These two things are going to put you on edge. These two things are going to increase the likelihood of you developing generalized anxiety disorder. And sure enough, researchers have demonstrated that people with GAD hold these maladaptive assumptions, especially about fear and danger. From a biological perspective, and this is the last perspective we're going to talk about, and then I'm going to show you one of the clinical screeners that we tend to use as therapists. But the biological perspective suggests that there are genetic factors, neurotransmitter factors at play that cause generalized anxiety disorder. So let's talk about genetic factors. So if we look at family pedigree studies, we tend to see that generalized anxiety disorder runs in families. Now, you may recall that I mentioned earlier in the video that approximately 6% of the population will be diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. But if we look at genetics, if you have a biological relative who also was diagnosed with GAD, then the rate goes up from 6% all the way up to 15%. And what we see is that the closer the relative, the greater the likelihood. Now, this makes sense because if it's identical twins, your genetic similarity is much more than regular siblings, and siblings is much more than cousins and so forth. So the more similar the genes, the more similar the outcomes. But as we become less similar or less close of a relative, we have more environmental differences and more genetic differences, which reduces the likelihood. So, but it's almost a 300% increase from the general population if you have a family member with GAD. So it does run in families. Now, the other theory is that there is a neurotransmitter called GABA, and GABA is responsible for inhibition. So it's a neurotransmitter that says stop firing, stop firing, stop firing. And what happens is that if GABA is not working or there's not the proper supply, then what will happen is you'll have excessive firing in the brain, and that will result in anxiety, in this case, generalized anxiety disorder. And what's interesting is that we do see GABA's relationship to anxiety and generalized anxiety disorder because in the 1950s, we discovered benzodiazepine, things like Xanax or Valium. And what we found is that uh, those, those drugs bind to GABA neurons, and that ultimately helps calm down anxiety. So that is our brief lecture, but what I want to do now is pull up a screener and take you through that as well, so you see what a clinician is looking for. Okay, so I've pulled up what's called the GAD-7 scale, or the GAD-7. And it measures generalized anxiety disorder. But what you'll see is that there's a series of questions we tend to ask in this screener. It's called a GAD-7 because there are 7 items. So it asks, in the past 2 weeks, have you been bothered by the following problems? Feeling nervous, anxious, or on edge, which is a hallmark feature of anxiety. Having not being able to control or stop your worrying about many different things. Now, that third one is really important because with generalized anxiety disorder, what you worry about is everything and anything. So there's not one particular thing that you're worrying about. Today, it could be about, I don't know, getting your taxes in. Tomorrow, it could be about an observation at work. Anything that you can think of in that moment will induce that anxiety. So if a person starts to feel like they're worrying about everything and anything, sort of like the worry war as we describe them, that is a telltale sign of generalized anxiety disorder. We also look at, can you relax? How can you wind down? Are you able to sit still? Are you easily annoyed or irritable, or do you have that dread or feeling that something often awful is going to happen? So there are these 7 items, and you could answer not at all if you didn't have that symptom. Several days, which is a few days out of the week, more than half the days, and then nearly every day. Now, clinically speaking, we are interested in more than half of the days or nearly every day, because that suggests a more severe case of anxiety. But you'll notice that we add up all of the numbers. So if you add up all the zeros, all the ones, twos, and threes that you selected, you're going to get a total score, right? You're going to get a total score for anxiety. And ultimately, we look at your total score, we add it up, and then we're going to come to the following point. If a person's screener was anywhere between 0 to 4, we call that minimal anxiety. This person is really not struggling with anxiety. 5 to 9, this person has anxiety, but it's mild anxiety. In the past, we may not have even taken this person in for treatment because, these are everyday stressors we're seeing. But now we do actually take people to help them not morph into more severe forms of anxiety. But if you have a score of 10 or above, that is a good indicator that you probably have generalized anxiety disorder. And we would start to work on therapies to help you regulate your anxiety, help you identify potential cognitive errors. We might look at some of the factors that require you to feel like you need to be perfect. And in very severe cases, we might even recommend medication management or prescribing of anxiolytics like Xanax and so forth might be part of the treatment. So that is our lesson, our discussion about anxiety, and in particular, generalized anxiety disorder. This is the first of the 30 videos in 30 days. So I hope you liked it. I'm going to be putting up more videos. If you like the video, like, subscribe. And if you want to see the videos that are going to follow, please hit the notifications tab, and it will let you know when I've released another video. So thank you for your time, and till next time, people.